Welcome back to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3. And this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. And this week is my first week back with a brand new show, my first week back after my husband's campaign and after coming off the trail. And a lot has happened. You know, I took a couple of weeks to just kind of decompress. When you run for office, even if it's your spouse, it's like you're running together, and or at least you should be. And that being said, it takes a toll on you. For 11 months straight, you're pretty much getting up every single day. You have a strict schedule, and most cases you're getting up early and coming home late, and it's a lot of work, and you would think that that would be the case for every candidate, but I know that that's not the case. There are candidates who choose to run for office and actually run for office, meeting people, hearing from you, wanting to engage. And then there are folks who really don't care to do all of that. They shoot you flyers or push cards and stuff in the mail. They, may send you text messages. You see them on your TV screen, but you won't see him in your neighborhood, that's for sure. So, that's just not the type of candidacy my husband had. He was very much so on the ground, and I think that's just the right way to do it, right? If you really want to represent the people, you need to know what their needs are and what their concerns are. And so a lot has happened, and, yeah, I have some thoughts and some feelings regarding the midterm primary and, that just passed, and now the current, runoff election that is currently underway here in Georgia um, for the 2026 midterms. And my thoughts are not just my personal feelings on my husband's race, but the entire process. And mostly what I'm noticing and what I find to be a bit disturbing when it comes to our election process. I've been in politics now for over 2 decades. And so we're talking 20 years of just, working behind the scenes and assisting with campaigns and learning the ropes and doing media and all kinds of stuff in the political world. And I'm seeing something that is a bit disturbing. So we've never felt comfortable locking ourselves into one position or one faction as a couple, because I honestly can see all sides of the argument. We've been able to sit with people and we've been able to see it all. And depending on what room we are in and who's telling the story, we've been called MAGA, we've been called establishment, moderates, etc. I don't think we've been called a rhino, possibly by somebody. And the reason why we don't find ourselves falling into factions is because they change. Case in point, there was a woman here in Georgia who was totally against my husband when he ran for U.S. Senate, and her reasoning, based on her newsletter, whatever she sends out, is because he was appointed by Governor Brian Kemp to a state board. And a few years later, fast forward to today, and now she's supporting the Kemp Senate pick, Derek Dooley. So to be honest, I haven't had much respect for her. I don't have any respect for her, to be quite honest, because of the fact that she does flip flop a lot. And this is the epitome of the pot calling the kettle black. And it represents the dangerous hypocrisies that plague our politics. I think we've all heard the saying that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Today's table topic, we're going to talk about the midterms, and we're going to talk about the silent epidemic that I see occurring that is quite concerning, but at the same time, there's not much you can do about it if you don't know what's going on. So when we decided to run for office, when my husband said he was going to run for Secretary of State, my husband's Kelvin King, we knew that not winning was on the table, but we prioritized doing what we believe is the right thing to do over winning. We prioritize making sure that we are representatives for Christ before we become representatives of the people rather than just winning. And so that's something that we just kind of pushed to the back of our mind, and we just said, okay, duty is ours, results is the Lord. And not that we didn't want to win or we don't want to win. Of course we do. But we want to be pleasing to God first. We want to be a good representation of Him before anything else, because there has been several times, particularly in the Bible, when we see God give people what they want, and not because it is His will for them, but because they so desperately desired it, because they begged for it. They felt like they had to have it. In many cases, what they wanted turned out to be something that they ended up despising. The Israelites wanted a king, so God gave them Saul, and we all saw how that worked out. So in our home, we prioritize God's will above our own. And that means that we're in for a adventure, and our life has been an adventure, and it's been a fun one because, what we think makes sense may not be a part of the plan, the larger plan of God, and vice versa. And we are welcome to that. And I think that's just an easy way to live. It's a peaceful way to live. You don't get wrapped up in what you don't get or what you do get. You just settle for what God has ordained for you. And whether we agree with the outcome or some of the questionable election strategies and things of that nature, all of that is submitted under the fact that we know that God allowed it. So what he allows, what he permits, is a part of his will. And so we accept that while also doing our due diligence. But ultimately, you have to find rest. You have to find contentment in whatever state you are in. I find it quite fascinating when I see people who obtain the most votes without having campaigned at all or asked anyone for their vote. It does lead to questions and questionable outcomes. And I do find it fascinating when I see leaders who tell you to support candidates simply because they would like you to in order to maintain the status quo, which happens to be their status quo. I mean, these are all things that I can't control, though. So that's when you go back to that reliance on God and reliance on the fact that He allowed it. But there are aspects of politics that we, the people, can control. And that is where my frustration lies. It's an honest, righteous frustration because I want to see us do better. I want to see us be better. So, whether you believe that the election was stolen or you believe there are shady players or you believe that, things are on the up and up and we don't have anything to worry about. And this is just where we are today. And we're just, there are people who have issues, but it doesn't really mean much. One thing we should all agree on is that we have a sheepish, weak electorate. This has to have nothing to do with your book sets, your intellect, your college degrees, your professional, acumen, or the amount of money you have. The fact of the matter is, if you are one of those people who was asking around about who you should vote for rather than looking them up yourself, then yeah, it's a little bit sheepish and it's a weak electorate. So now here's the thing. Before we go any further, if you're not ready to hear some hard truths, if you're not ready to have your toes stepped on a little bit, then this is probably where you should turn this show off because I'm going to highlight something I've seen over my 20 years of working in politics, having worked for candidates, having worked on campaigns, having run campaigns, having been the spouse of a candidate. I have seen this from multiple angles. And there are some hard truths that we have got to hit. We've got to discuss it. So after the break, I'm going to share number one, frustration with this past midterm election cycle, primary, as well as the thoughts that kind of keep me up at night. The things that I think about sometimes when I'm just kind of laying in bed in the dark of night and processing. I'm going to share those things. So this is the Janelle King Show right here on Extra 106.3. Don't leave the table. We're just getting started. Thank you so much for joining the show. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be notified every time I upload new content. Now back to the discussion. Welcome back to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King. This is Extra 106.3, and this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. In today's table topic, we're talking about the midterms and the silent epidemic that I absolutely see coming. Matter of fact, it's here, it's upon us. But the amount of people who don't know what's going on is fascinating because it's literally right in front of our faces. And before the break, we laid the groundwork for today's table topic, and we talked about refusing to bow down to political factions, not finding yourself in those, spaces, as well as the blatant hypocrisy of political flip-floppers that protect their own status quo. And then I also talked about why we are prioritizing God's will and why that matters so much and so much more than winning a race. It's important to pay attention to God's will for your life. And that's because in history, we've seen in some of the scriptures where we had King Saul getting what he wanted, and it's not always what's best for us. The Israelites wanted the king, they got him. He turned out to not be a good king. King Saul wanted what he wanted, he got it. He ended up losing his mind. Like, there's sometimes what you want is not what's best, and you have to be open to that. So we definitely discussed that, and we looked into the things in politics that we can't control. But now it's time to step on some toes and to talk about what we, the people, can control. Because there's so much that we can control, but we don't. Because whether you think that our elections are completely compromised or totally up and up, we have to confront the reality that we are dealing with a weak and sheepish electorate. And that's why I wanted to share one of my biggest frustrations. And it is how uneducated voters are regarding their own rights and duties. Not just the politicians. Before we even get there, my frustration is the fact that we don't understand our own rights and our duties and our responsibilities as voters. That we hand it over to other people. This frustration is not a fear, but it's more like a premonition of what I believe is to come as a result of this problem. It's a seed. Whether you think that, when I sit it out or I don't vote or I, don't research the candidates and I don't really actually formally do my duty, I think a lot of people think that it doesn't matter and nothing happens, it doesn't change, my vote doesn't matter. But it's not true. You're planting a seed. And those are the thoughts that keep me up at night. It's the fact that I know that at some point, the seed that's already in the ground is going to start producing. And I am starting to see it. It's almost like I see that little bit of greenery that's coming up through the dirt. And this frustration is driving this conversation because I want you to understand what's really going on. But before we address the fruit of this problem, we have to look at its root. We have to understand how we got here. We have to look at what the founders of this country actually built and how far our culture has drifted from that blueprint and why that blueprint was necessary. Today we constantly hear the word democracy thrown around. It's democracy, democracy, democracy. But if that was the case, then that would mean that whatever 51% decides, then that is what is declared. But the founders didn't build a pure democracy. There's a democratic process when it comes to our voting, but even that is not a majority rule. What our forefathers, our founding fathers, what they built was a constitutional republic. The system was built to withstand human nature, emotional whims, and political manipulation. But that system only works if you understand the machine that has been placed in our laps to be responsible for. So when we acknowledge that many of us don't know who our state rep is, more or less who our tax commissioner is, then we become derelict in our own duties as a citizen. You're saying that I think that my own little personal life matters more than protecting the republic that your life dwells in. It's harmful. And by limiting the power of the federal government, not by giving the government all of our power, or even worse, power over ourselves. That's not how this is supposed to work. In the original text of Article 1, Section 2, the founders explicitly left the qualifications for voting to the individual states. And this wasn't an oversight. This wasn't I'm just going to give you a little something here. It was very intentional. It was an intentional nod to federalism or states' rights. They believed that local communities, not a centralized federal monolith, should govern the mechanics of elections. This is why this whole narrative around taking over elections federally is ridiculous. I mean, it's just the Constitution doesn't even support it. So now over time, of course, the Constitution had been amended. You have the 15th Amendment, the 19th, the 26th Amendment, but we didn't change the structure of the republic, even though there are amendments. We perfected it by ensuring that federal protections kept states from unjustly denying the ballot to qualified citizens. But a protected right to vote means absolutely nothing if the electorate completely abdicates their duty that comes with having this right. In other words, there's no need to protect anyone's right to vote if they're not going to vote, or if they're going to vote without knowing who they're voting for. What are we protecting if you don't even know what needs to be protected? So what is the root of this crisis that I believe that we are facing today? I think the root is a systemic failure of civic literacy. We have an electorate that has been conditioned to view voting as a tool for personal or partisan gain rather than a solemn responsibility to preserve liberty. It's only seen as I'm helping my side or I'm helping myself. It's not about preserving the liberty or the protections of the republic. So people are graduating into the voting booth without a basic understanding of separation of powers, federalism, or even natural rights. They don't know their rights. So if you don't know your rights, how do you recognize when your rights are being eroded? And if you don't know what your duties are, then you certainly don't know what the duties are of those who you elect, which means that you don't hold leaders accountable to the Constitution or to what they are supposed to be doing. And that brings me back to the fruit of the problem. When voters are uneducated about the foundations of their own government, they become easily manipulated by emotional rhetoric and demagogues. They trade long-term constitutional protections for short-term security and political victories. And that premonition that I think about late at night, that premonition that I believe is occurring right before our eyes, what is that? Well, it's the erosion of our republic from within. It's the transition from a nation ruled by law to a nation ruled by the shifting whims and winds of public dependency and a mob mentality. This is the exact nightmare the founders warned us about. If you look at Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison warned us about the single greatest threat to a free society. He called it factions. He said factions are groups of citizens united by a common passion or interest that is contrary to the rights of others or the permanent interests of the nation. Madison knew that in a pure democracy, which is why they did not select that method, a faction could secure a simple majority and use the power of the state to trample on the minority. His solution was a representative republic, where the voters' primary duty is to elect representatives who have the wisdom to refine and enlarge the public's view, to take their ideas, their concepts, their wishes, their desires, and platform them. The entire system relies on voters' capacity to look past the short-term partisan self-interests and to choose leaders who will uphold the rule of law and the Constitution. That is what you do in a representative republic. I remember meeting with a very bright young man who has like this great, huge future ahead of him, particularly, in politics. He could have done a whole lot, And I remember asking him if he'd be willing to assist us on our campaign. This was before we even announced or Kelvin came out. And I found it odd that his the line of questioning was so much centered around other candidates and other people. There wasn't much talk about platform positions or the integrity of the candidate. We were pretty much flat out told that if you don't 100% get on board with our current governor, then I can't support you. And I'm like, huh, that's the faction mentality that I believe is eroding us. It's the exact kind of thinking that pushes your personal duty to the side and, in my opinion, causes you to become a sheep. I'm like, you don't have your own personal views? People don't have that anymore. So that leads me to Federalist Paper number 51, where Madison famously wrote that a dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on the government. If the people is the control on the government. We, the people, not a couple of folks, not a handful of leaders, not a couple of, not one person. We, the people, we are the control. We are the primary control on the government, according to Madison. And I want you to notice the word he used, which is control. Voting is not a passive privilege. It is not an exercise in choosing who gives away the best freebies or who gives you the most charismatic speech, who tickles your fancy. That's not what this is about. Voting is an active, defensive duty. It is the citizen's job to act as a check on government expansion, tyranny, growth overriding us. We are the checks on the government. The voter is supposed to be the gatekeeper, keeping the federal government locked inside its constitutional boundaries. That is our responsibility as a voter. Now, while the Constitution establishes the legal mechanisms and involving protections of the franchise, the Federalist Papers provided a philosophical architecture framing voting not just as a privilege, but as an essential safeguard against tyranny. That's what our forefathers, and that's what those who were around 250 years ago, that's how they saw it. That's how important this duty was, this responsibility was. And the U.S. Constitution approach to voting has always been a dynamic shift from this decentralized mechanism managed by individual states to a more inclusive, federally protected right. So, in the original 1787 text, the Constitution did not explicitly guarantee a universal right to vote. Instead, it was Article 1, Section 2 that delegated the qualifications for voting to these states, stipulating that electors of the House of Representatives must meet the same qualifications required for the most numerous branch of their state legislature. So, when you fast forward to Article 2, Section 1, it left the method of appointing presidential electors to state legislatures. So going back to federalism, it's just like we're a colony, and every colony gets a vote. What does the colonies get to vote on? The colonies get to vote who represents them. That representative is supposed to come from them. They're supposed to be someone who understands them, who can carry their concerns. Most folks vote for people they have no idea what that individual stands for, but most importantly, they don't even realize that that individual doesn't know what you want or what you stand for. So how could they possibly represent you? When no one has any idea what the people who they come from want, desires, or even expects of them. We're just sitting these folk on to do what? However, the Constitution did embed a core promise in Article Section 4, which is called the Guarantee Clause, which ensures that every state in the Union maintains a Republican form of government. So while the states have their own rights, what they can't do is move us from a republic to a democracy or from a republic to a dictatorship. So your state can't operate as a dictatorship. It can't operate as a monarch. It has to operate as a Republican form of government. And this clause inherently requires a government that is derived from the consent of the governed, executed through regular elections. So the only way you can maintain a republic is by requiring the actual system, the government, to consent to those it governs. And you do that through elections. So over the centuries, the Constitution was amended to transform voting from an elite privilege to this broadly protected right. These amendments did not grant the right to vote directly, but rather it restricted states from denying it based on a specific criteria. You had the 15th Amendment, which prohibited the denial of a vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, so whether or not they were a slave or not. You have the 19th Amendment, which extended the franchise by prohibiting the voter from discriminating based on sex. You have the 24th Amendment that came around in 1964, which abolished the poll tax, removing financial barriers from the ballot box. You had the 26th Amendment in 1971, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, aligning the right to vote with the age of the military, with the military age. So all of these things came in play in order to strengthen your ability, in order to make it easier for the governed to control the government. That was the whole point. And through these constitutional updates, the right to vote became a fundamental shield, protecting citizens, protecting their voices from an arbitrary government that will exclude them. So for people who say, I don't feel like my vote counts, I don't feel like my vote matters, I don't feel like I care, I feel like I'm excluded, these amendments, as well as the Constitution, provides you a shield from that. And if you read the Federalist Paper number 39, Madison defined a republic as a government that derives all of its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, quote, end quote. He emphasized that a government favored only by a small, wealthy class would be a tyranny, not a republic. That's what Madison saw. It's amazing that they were able to see this so far ahead. Therefore, the duty to vote extends across the entire fabric of our society, ensuring that the government remains reflective of the whole population. And that leads me to Federalist Paper 52, where the authors underscore the importance of frequent elections for the House of Representatives. This frequency ensures that representatives remain strictly accountable to their constituents, but it simultaneously demands that the voters maintain continuous active engagement rather than occasional participation. And the fact that they didn't put term limits on the House of Representatives, on Congress, I believe that was an oversight that they probably didn't see happening. They probably thought that people would go there, go to work, and then come back home. But because the voters, and to be quite frank with you, I would think that because of all these voters protections and voting, stipulations and all that stuff, they probably couldn't see a world where voters didn't vote, where they didn't choose who represented them, where they didn't care about who represented them. They didn't see that as even an option. So there was no need for term limits back then because the people were the term limits, just like how the people can be the term limits today. But instead, we've become occasional participators rather than a continuous, active, engaged group. So the rights outlined in the Constitution mean very little without the execution of the duties described in these Federalist Papers. If citizens view voting merely as an optional right rather than an active duty, then the representative frameworks risk decay. Conversely, without the constitutional protections ensuring access to the ballot, the philosophical ideals of a self-governing populace cannot be realized. So, from an objective perspective of America's founding literature, voting emerges as a dual concept. The Constitution guarantees the freedom of access to the ballot box, ensuring that the government cannot easily silence its citizens. Meanwhile, as you read the Federalist Papers, they remind you that the electorate that the preservation of the republic, the continuance of the republic, the healthiness of the republic solely depends entirely on how seriously citizens take their responsibility to vote. That is what the Federalist Papers were telling us. Is that, yeah, the Constitution's here. Yeah, the Constitution gives you the right. Yeah, the Constitution protects you. However, you, and ultimately, the founders designed a system where the government is legally obligated to listen. But the citizens are civically obligated to speak. What are they listening to if you're not talking? And if we, the people, the citizens, drop the ball, we drop the republic. So that leads me to what has kept me up at night and why our personal solution is the silent epidemic. And I'm going to close the show with this. You don't want to miss it. We're almost done. You're listening to the Janelle King Show right here on Extra 106.3. Don't leave the table. Thank you so much for joining the show. Please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you'll be notified every time I upload new content. Now back to the discussion. Welcome back to the Janelle King Show. I'm Janelle King, and this is Extra 106.3. And this is where we discuss kitchen table topics that are typically banned from family gatherings, but are absolutely necessary in order to have a strong republic. And today's table topic is the midterms and the silent epidemic. So as we bring the table to a close and we all get ready to finish, everything we've unpacked comes down to an undeniable truth, one undeniable truth. We have looked at the brilliant machinery of our constitutional republic, the original intent for our founders, the profound balance between our legal protected rights and our civic duties. And when you synthesize the American foundation, the picture becomes crystal clear that the Constitution guarantees our freedom and access to the ballot box, ensuring that a centralized government cannot easily silence its citizen. But that's all it does. It provides us access. It is up to us to do our duty. And meanwhile, the Federalist Papers reminds us that the preservation of this entire experiment, because that's what this is, a 250-year experiment, depends entirely on how seriously we, the electorate, takes our responsibility to vote. The rights outlined in the Constitution means absolutely nothing without the execution of the duties that Madison and Hamilton and Jay laid out. If citizens view voting merely as an optional privilege, or worse, if we allow ourselves to be swept up in a blind faction driven by a mob mentality where we care more about protecting someone's partisan status quo than their integrity, the representative framework of this nation will decay from within. The founders designed a system where the government is legally obligated to listen to the people, but as I stated before, there's no need for them to listen if the citizens are not speaking. And that leads me right back to what has me staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night. And the warning that I want to leave with you as we close the show today. That's if we, the people, If we, the citizens, drop the ball, we drop the republic. The ultimate solution to this silent epidemic that I see coming isn't going to come from a centralized federal monolith. It's certainly not going to come from political flip-floppers who join factions based on what they think is beneficial to them at that moment and then demonize everybody else. The solution is a personal one. If you're listening, I want you to just look at this from a personal perspective. It starts with a commitment to civic literacy, a refusal to be treated like sheep herded in one direction, and a dedication to prioritizing God's will over our own short-term political desires. The machinery only works, the system only moves if you understand how to run it. So I want to close the show by discussing, like I said, what's keeping me up and why the solution to this problem is the silent epidemic. When we have 10 million people living in the state of Georgia, and out of those 10 million people, only about 7 million of those people are registered to vote. And then let's be honest, that number would likely drop significantly if our voter rolls were actually clean. But it gets even worse. Out of those few registered voters in the grand scheme of things, we are seeing a tiny fraction actively showing up to the ballot box, right around the tune of 2 million people. 10 million here, 7 registered, 2 vote. That's insane. Think about that. Out of 10 million citizens, a mere 2 million are making the decisions for everybody else. And people are allowing this to happen. And out of those 2 million who do show up, I would venture to say that less than 1% of them actually know who their state rep is, and an even smaller percentage has a clue about who their local officials are. So tell me, how do we do our civic duty with numbers like this? But then we all complain. Everyone's moaning and groaning. When we don't do our homework, when you refuse to understand the system of our own government, then you become easily manipulated and you end up voting based on another person's self-interest rather than your own. And for those who do the work, our votes are being completely diluted because we are forced to vote alongside an electorate that is utterly uneducated on the basics of liberty. And that brings me to the quiet epidemic that is officially upon us. It is the crisis that was predicted a long time ago in this famous novel written by Ayn Rand called Atlas Shrugged. She wrote about a world that was collapsing under the weight of big government oppression, and she introduced the question, who is John Galt? In the novel, Galt is a brilliant creator who leads a strike of the mind, convincing society's producers, those who are innovators, those who are builders, those who are the hard workers, to completely walk away rather than let a parasitic, bureaucratic system live off of their labor. They said, we'll just walk away from it. We'll let you all see how you all figure it out without those who care, without those who are really trying to do this the right way, without the producers, without the innovators, without the builders, without the job creators. Let's see what you do when we all walk away. And this phrase represents this terrifying reality of what I believe is happening when a society penalizes achievement. When the people holding the world up eventually shrugs. That's what this novel was about. And when those people leave the system to collapse under its own weight. And in today's term, going Galt is the deliberate choice to pull off the grid, buy land, choose total self-sufficiency, because you refuse to let an abusive government leech off of your hard work. Well, look around. The silent epidemic is that the world is shrugging, and that the question is more real today than it's ever been before. I know more people than I've ever known in my life who are walking away from all walks of life who are noticing, and I'm noticing that this is a deeply disturbing trend, but at the same time, I understand it because I have to agree with them to a certain degree. I understand why they feel this way. I mean, the number of upper middle class to the extremely wealthy people who I've met who have a concrete plan to completely or partially disconnect from the grid is staggering. I know far more people today than I did 10 years ago who have either purchased land, who are actively planning to start homesteading, who are, and to be completely transparent with you, Kelvin and I are doing the same. We've already bought our land. We've already purchased it. But we have to ask the hard question, what happens when the producers, when those who are fighting for the republic, who understands what I'm talking about, who are builders, who create, who sustain society, what happens when they all run for the hills and leave those, the moochers, who the book refers to as those who tend to just sit around and let everybody else do their duty for them? What happens when they're left to fend for themselves? What happens to the other 49 states when everyone flees the overreach of their own local governments and they move to the free state of Florida, which we're all seeing that happen as well? Listen to me. It is not in American or human nature to sit back and endure endless abuse and oppression from the government without eventually finding a way out from under it. So right now, there is a massive decision on the table. For every single person listening to my voice, get in the game or prepare to suffer the consequences. If you choose to stay disengaged, if you choose to neglect your duty, you are signing up for the consequences. You are choosing the continued poisoning of our food supply with chemicals and preservatives. Because Big Pharma and the food lobbyists are more than happy to step in and do your job as we the people. You are choosing to end female athletics as we know it, because in today's world, apparently, if you put on a wig and a dress and step in, you can then steal a young woman's hard-earned college scholarship. You're choosing a continued rise in taxes that will strip away every single dime that you have rightfully earned. And you are choosing to welcome election fraud as long as your preferred side or your friends happen to win. I mean, the list can go on and on. So yes, I absolutely believe that the state of Georgia could turn blue. But hear me clearly. A political shift isn't the real epidemic we are facing. The true epidemic is the sheer number of people who couldn't care less. It's the evangelicals who have completely checked out, having chosen to just be submitted to God and are just passively open to whatever happens, entirely abdicating their earthly responsibility. It is the apathetic voter who convinces themselves that the elections are rigged anyway, so what's the use of showing up? It's the voters who decide that because politics causes friction in our families, they would rather never discuss it at all. And it's the compliant voters who blindly trust the government and the establishment insiders to make big decisions for the rest of us. Those are the factions that matter to me. That is the quiet epidemic driving voter participation down into the dirt. We have dropped the ball. And now we have to make a choice. Do we pick the ball back up, educate ourselves, and reassert our power as voters? Or do we hand all of our power over to the ruling class and just blindly trust that they will care about our personal interests without a single checks and balance left to stop them? Because change is coming. You will either fight together or those who are still attached to the system will fight each other alone. We have a lot to think about. So until next time, stay unafraid, stay unapologetic, and never stop seeking the truth.